A mortgage officer told me, apologetically, over the phone, that I already had an active home loan in another state, under my own name and my own social security number. I told her that was impossible. I had never, in my entire life, been to that state. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, in the careful voice of someone who has clearly said this sentence before to other confused people, I understand this is going to be a lot to process. I think you need to speak with our fraud department. It took 3 weeks of bank fraud departments, confused customer service calls, and one deeply uncomfortable visit to my local Social Security office before I understood what had actually happened to my life without my knowledge. Someone had been living as me for 12 years. I want to walk you through how I discovered this, because the specific shape of the discovery is what made everything that came after so disorienting. I'm 34. I work in logistics, unremarkably, for a regional shipping company. I have never had reason to closely scrutinize my own credit history, the way most people don't, until I applied for a mortgage on a small house I've been saving toward for 3 years, and the loan officer came back with a file that, according to her screen, showed an existing 30-year mortgage, opened 9 years earlier, on a house in a state I had genuinely never set foot in, under my exact legal name and my exact social security number. My first assumption, like most people's would be, was a simple clerical error, a transposed digit, a database glitch, the kind of thing you assume will resolve itself with one phone call. It did not resolve itself with one phone call. I spent the better part of that first week being transferred between departments, repeating my social security number to increasingly apologetic representatives, each of whom would go quiet for a slightly longer pause than the last person before saying some version of, "I'm showing something unusual here too. Let me escalate this." By the end of that first week, I had been escalated 4 times and had learned absolutely nothing except that whatever this was, it was not a simple clerical error, and that the people whose job it was to reassure confused customers were themselves visibly unsettled by what they were seeing on their own screens. It took, instead, an increasingly unsettling unraveling of just how much of my own financial identity had apparently been quietly, carefully managed by someone else for over a decade. The Social Security Administration eventually confirmed what the bank's fraud department had already begun to suspect. My number had 2 distinct, active credit histories attached to it, the second one beginning almost exactly 12 years earlier and continuing, without a single missed payment or red flag serious enough to trigger automatic fraud detection, right up to the present. Whoever was living as me had opened a modest checking account, then a car loan, paid off in full and on time 4 years later, then a small business credit line for what public filings eventually showed was a home cleaning service register in that other state. Then, 9 years ago, the mortgage that had finally, accidentally, collided with my own real application. My actual credit score, I learned with a specific kind of vertigo, was excellent. Not because of anything I'd done, but because someone else had spent 12 years being scrupulously, meticulously responsible with my name. I want to be honest about how strange that particular detail was to sit with. Most people's minds, mine included, go immediately to worst-case identity theft. Some are maxing out cards, vanishing, leaving you to clean up ruined credit and years of collection calls. That is not remotely what had happened to me. Whoever this was had, for 12 consecutive years, protected my name more carefully than I had ever protected it myself. I remember sitting at my own kitchen table with a printed copy of that second credit history, tracing the small, patient decisions of a stranger's entire financial life laid out in neat rows of dates and payment amounts, feeling less like a victim of theft and more like I was reading a very detailed diary written by someone who had, against every reasonable expectation, apparently taken excellent care of a life I hadn't known I was sharing. The fraud department's investigation, combined with my own increasingly obsessive digging through public records over the following month, slowly built a picture of a woman, roughly my own age, living under my exact name in a small city, 11 states away. She was, according to the business registration for the cleaning service, married, and according to a local elementary school's parent newsletter I found archived online, a mother of 1 child, a 9-year-old boy whose school photo, when I finally found it, I stared at for a long, uncomfortable time, a child with my legal last name who had absolutely no idea that name wasn't, in any official government sense, actually his own. I drove out to that state myself, 11 hours, alone, in the rain for most of the last stretch, rather than simply handing everything to the fraud department and letting the legal process grind forward without me. I've had to be honest with myself since about why I did that instead of the simpler thing. Some part of me needed to actually see the person who had been quietly wearing my life for over a decade before I decided what I felt about it. I remember stopping twice on that drive. Once at a gas station somewhere around hour 6, standing in the parking lot in the rain just to clear my head, running through every version of what I might find at the end of it. A professional con artist mid-scheme, a stranger who'd simply gotten lucky and greedy, someone I might genuinely need to be afraid of, given that whoever this was had proven, over 12 years, to be extremely good at not getting caught. I found her. I'll call her Marissa, which isn't her real name, for reasons that will become clear, at the address the mortgage was registered to, a modest, well-kept house with a child's bicycle leaned against the porch railing. I sat in my car outside that house for almost 40 minutes before I worked up the nerve to knock, running through every version of the confrontation I'd rehearsed on the long drive out, none of which prepared me for what actually happened when a woman who was, unmistakably, using my name opened the door, took one look at the papers in my hand, and went completely, silently pale in a way that told me, before either of us said a single word, that she had been waiting for this exact moment for 12 years. She didn't scream or slam the door or try to lie her way through it, which I think, looking back, surprised me more than almost anything else that happened that afternoon. She simply stood there for a long moment, one hand still on the door, and said, very quietly, "You found me," not as a question, but as a fact she'd apparently been rehearsing in her own head for over a decade. The way you rehearse the one sentence you assume you'll eventually have to say out loud to a stranger who was never supposed to show up on your porch. She let me in. I want to tell you what she told me, sitting at her kitchen table while her son, thankfully, was still at school, because I think it's the part of this story that actually matters. Marissa's real name, the one she told me that afternoon, the one I've promised, and intend to keep promising, never to say publicly, belonged to a woman who had spent her 20s in a relationship with a man whose violence, by the time she finally left him, had escalated to the point where a domestic violence advocate had told her, plainly, that leaving through ordinary legal channels, a restraining order, a documented separation, anything with a paper trail, was likely to get her killed, given his specific history of finding women who'd left him through exactly those channels. She left instead the way a small, desperate number of people in her situation do, completely, with no paper trail at all, cutting every legal thread connecting her old identity to her new location. 12 years earlier, in a bus station bathroom 2 states from where she'd started, with almost nothing to her name and a plan that extended, at that point, no further than the next 24 hours, she found a wallet someone had genuinely, innocently lost. My wallet, as it turned out, dropped during a work trip I barely remembered taking, containing my driver's license, my social security card, which I'd foolishly been carrying that week for an unrelated paperwork errand, and about $60 in cash. She told me she sat in that bathroom for a long time, staring at my license, at a stranger's face and a stranger's name, before she made the decision that built the next 12 years of both our lives. She could disappear as herself, permanently, terrified every day that a paper trail would eventually lead him back to her. Or she could, carefully, patiently, become someone else entirely, someone with an already established, unremarkable, unsuspicious identity that a dangerous man would have no reason on earth to ever go looking for, because he had never once heard my name. I remember thinking, she told me, turning her coffee cup slowly on the kitchen table, not quite looking at me, that whoever this man in the photo was, he looked like someone whose life nobody was watching very closely. I needed a life nobody was watching very closely. I'm sorry it had to be yours. She told me the first year was the hardest, learning to answer to a name that wasn't hers without hesitating, practicing a signature that matched my own driver's license until it became, eventually, more automatic than her actual handwriting had ever been. She worked cash jobs at first, cautious, terrified of any paperwork at all, before slowly, deliberately, over several years, easing into the more stable, documented life that would eventually make her credit so quietly excellent, a calculated risk, she said, that a well-documented, thoroughly unremarkable financial life was actually safer than staying invisible forever, because invisibility itself, in her experience, tended to draw exactly the kind of suspicious attention she could never afford. She built her new life with a specific, almost unbearable carefulness that I came to understand. Sitting at that kitchen table wasn't about ambition or greed at all. It was about never once giving anyone, ever, a reason to look closely at the identity she was wearing, to accidentally trace a thread back to who she'd actually been before. That's why the credit was perfect. That's why every payment was on time, every filing correct, every year quieter and more careful than the last. A messy, suspicious financial history might have drawn exactly the kind of scrutiny that could eventually have connected her, however indirectly, back to the man she'd spent 12 years making sure could never find her. I asked her because I genuinely needed to know whether she'd ever felt guilty about what she was doing to me, to my actual name, out in the world. She told me something I still think about often. She said she'd told herself, for years, a story that let her sleep at night. That whoever the man on that license was, she was, in her own strange way, taking better care of his name than most people take of their own, and that if he ever found out, she hoped, somewhere underneath the shock, he might understand that she'd never once used it to hurt anyone. I used to imagine, she told me, that you were out there somewhere, living your actual life, completely unbothered, while I quietly kept your credit score healthier than it had any right to be. I like that story. I know it doesn't make it right. I sat with that admission for a long time, in a kitchen that belonged, on paper, more legally to a version of me that had never lived there than it did to the actual woman who'd raised a child inside it. I want to be honest about the several weeks that followed, because the decision in front of me was genuinely harder than I expected it to be walking into that house. The straightforward, legally correct thing to do was obvious. Report the fraud fully. Let federal investigators handle a case that, at this point, involved a genuine Social Security crime spanning 12 years in 2 states. I understood, sitting across from her, that doing exactly that carried a real, serious risk of a chain of events I could not fully predict or control once it started. A legal case, public records, the specific kind of paper trail she had spent 12 years of her entire adult life making sure never existed, potentially surfacing in exactly the way that could put her back in danger from a man neither of us had any real way of knowing was even still looking for her, or still capable of the violence that had driven her to that bus station bathroom in the first place. I also understood, with equal clarity, that I could not simply do nothing. My actual legal identity was genuinely, materially entangled with hers in ways that would eventually cause real problems for me. Tax complications, the mortgage collision that had started all of this, the real possibility of future issues I couldn't yet predict. And beyond the practical tangle, there was something harder to name that I also couldn't simply set aside. An entire second financial life had been built, carefully, and without my consent, on top of my actual name. And some part of me needed my name back, regardless of how responsibly it had been borrowed. What I eventually did, over the following 4 months, working with a victim's advocate, a domestic violence organization, connected me to, once I explained the actual shape of the situation, was try to thread a needle I'm still not entirely certain I threaded correctly. Rather than filing a criminal fraud report that would have triggered a federal investigation with genuinely unpredictable consequences for a woman who had, whatever else was true, committed a real crime to survive a real threat, I worked instead through a specific legal process the advocates organization had experience with, establishing, through documentation of the domestic violence history and the advocate's own professional testimony, a legitimate legal name change and new, entirely separate Social Security number for Marissa, under an actual new identity of her own, built for the first time not on a stranger's dropped wallet, but on her own genuine, protected legal existence. The advocate, a patient, no-nonsense woman named Deborah, who I came to genuinely respect over those 4 months, walked both of us through a process I had no idea even existed. A legal pathway, rarely used and imperfectly documented, for survivors of exactly this kind of situation to establish protected new identities without having to first confess to years of accidental fraud committed along the way. It took those 4 months, several sworn statements from Marissa detailing the abuse she'd survived, a supporting statement from me confirming that no financial harm had ever actually come in my own name or accounts, and, I'll admit, more of my own time, and a modest amount of my own money in legal fees than I had any obligation to spend, before her mortgage, her business, her son's school records were all successfully transferred to a name that was actually, finally, legally hers. I remember the specific afternoon Deborah called to confirm the new Social Security number had been issued, and the sound Marissa made on the other end of a three-way call that I can only describe as 12 years of held breath finally, quietly, letting go. Only once that transfer was complete did I go to the Social Security Administration to formally, cleanly separate my own number from the tangle entirely, closing out 12 years of a second life lived under my name with what turned out to be a surprisingly simple final form. Once there was no longer a second active identity attached to the same number for the system to be confused by. I saw her one last time, the week everything was finalized, at the same kitchen table where she'd first told me the truth. She thanked me in a way that made both of us uncomfortable. The specific kind of gratitude that doesn't have a clean place to land because the situation it's responding to was never supposed to happen in the first place. Her son was home that day, doing homework at the other end of the table, and she introduced me, a little awkwardly, as someone helping mommy with some paperwork, which was, I suppose, the most honest short version of an extremely complicated truth that either of us could manage in front of a 9-year-old. I asked her, before I left, whether she was afraid, even now, of what might happen if the man from her old life ever somehow found his way to her new one, legally hers now instead of borrowed. She told me she thought about it every day, the way she said she probably always would, but that for the first time in 12 years, if he ever did find her, at least it would be her he found, standing on her own name, instead of a stranger's identity she'd been quietly terrified of losing the entire time she was hiding behind it. It's raining tonight. The same steady rain that was falling on the last stretch of that 11-hour drive out to a house I'd never expected to find at the end of a mortgage officer's confused phone call. My name is entirely my own again now. My credit history is single unbroken line instead of two tangled ones. My mortgage on the small house I originally set out to buy finally, ordinarily approved. I think about Marissa sometimes. I still don't know, and have decided I don't need to know what her actual name is now, which feels like the correct, final shape of a story that was never really about names at all. I get a card in December still, every year since it all resolved, and signed except for a small, familiar handwriting I'd recognize now anywhere, postmarked from a city I've promised myself never to look up. It never says much. Last year it simply said, "Still careful, still grateful. Hope your house is warm." I keep them in a drawer I don't open often, not because I need reminding, but because some things feel like they deserve to be kept rather than displayed. People ask me, when I tell this story, whether I feel like I let a criminal get away with something. I understand why they ask. It's a fair question, and I don't think there's a version of my answer that will satisfy everyone who hears it. But I've come to believe that the crime here was never really the 12 years she spent wearing my name. The crime was whatever happened to her before that bus station bathroom, thorough and violent enough to make disappearing into a stranger's identity feel like the only survivable option available to her. I didn't get my name back by punishing the person who borrowed it. I got it back by helping her finally, legally, safely, not need it anymore. If there's one thing I want someone to take from this, it's that identity, it turns out, is a strange and more flexible thing than any of us assume until we're forced to actually examine it. Mine was borrowed for 12 years by a stranger who needed it more urgently than I ever once did. I got it back exactly when she no longer had to be afraid to give it up.